Today is March 15th, 2026. Day 16 of a war the International Energy Agency has already called the largest oil supply disruption in the history of global energy markets, larger than the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s. This morning, Iran launched another wave of ballistic missiles and drones toward Israel, coordinated simultaneously with Hezbollah strikes from southern Lebanon. Sirens activated across Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and northern Israel at the same time. The IDF said its air defense layers were running at full capacity across multiple incoming vectors simultaneously. 2 people were injured, including a child seriously hurt in Iran's latest ballistic missile strike, according to medics on the ground, confirmed by the Times of Israel. It remains unclear whether those impacts came from falling intercept fragments or from submunitions released by a cluster warhead, a distinction that matters and will be addressed in this analysis. On the same morning, Israel's military said it had carried out roughly 7,600 strikes in Iran and approximately 100 in Lebanon since February 28th, according to IDF figures published today. Israel hit the main space research center in Tehran and a factory producing Iranian air defense systems. The IDF confirmed the strikes were designed not only to destroy, but to prevent rebuilding. Both sides were striking simultaneously this morning, Iran firing at Israel while Israel was striking inside Tehran, a pattern that has characterized the last several days of this conflict, and that the daily headline cycle has not consistently represented with precision. Now, the weapons dimension. Because this is the layer most daily coverage keeps skipping, and it explains why Israeli air defenses remain under continuous pressure on day 15. By day 10 of the war, Iran had fired roughly 300 missiles at Israel, and according to Wikipedia citing IDF assessments, nearly half of those carried cluster submunitions. Cluster warheads burst open at altitude and scattered dozens of explosive bomblets across a radius of up to 10 kilometers before any intercept system can engage individual submunitions. Amnesty International had already condemned Iran's use of cluster munitions during the June 2025 conflict as a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Iran has continued their use in this conflict. This is a deliberate, tactical adaptation. When missile volume drops because launchers have been destroyed or degraded, cluster warheads change the geometry of the problem, scattering the engagement challenge across an area, not concentrating it on a single incoming trajectory. In the assessment of defense analysts tracking this conflict, the shift from overwhelming missile volume to precision area weapons is one of the most significant and least discussed tactical developments of this 15-day war. On Friday night, Trump announced that U.S. forces had struck Iranian military installations on Kharg Island, what he publicly called Iran's crown jewel. According to Reuters and CENTCOM, roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports pass through Kharg before traveling through the Gulf. The island's military infrastructure was destroyed. Oil terminals were deliberately spared. Trump made that last point publicly and specifically in a post on Truth Social within minutes of announcing the operation. He wrote that the U.S. had totally obliterated every military target on Kharg, and then added that the oil infrastructure could be targeted. Next, if Iran continues blocking ships from the Strait of Hormuz. That single sentence is not purely a military statement, according to Reuters, citing Claire tanker tracking data. Kharg Island has loading capacity of approximately 7 million barrels per day and was holding roughly 18 million barrels in storage as of early March, according to a J.P. Morgan report citing Claire. Dan Pickering, chief investment officer at Pickering Energy Partners, stated the stakes plainly when he spoke to Reuters. Destroy Kharg's infrastructure, he said, and you take 2 million barrels per day off the global market, not temporarily, but permanently. No other major oil-producing country on earth, not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, not the UAE, concentrates that share of export capacity in a single geographic location, the way Iran does. Iran's annual oil export revenues run between $35 and $60 billion, depending on global prices, according to analysis by Global Statistics Today, citing J.P. Morgan and EIA data. That revenue stream funds an estimated 25 to 40% of Iran's government budget. And according to Iran's 2025 budget, 51% of oil revenues were allocated to the IRGC, the military organization currently operating the missile campaigns and maintaining the strait closure. Destroy Kharg's oil infrastructure and you do not just damage Iran's economy. You cut the primary funding source for the military operation that is currently firing missiles at Israel and keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed. That is the economic logic underlying the deliberate decision to leave the terminals intact. They are worth more as a confirmed, credible threat than as a destroyed target. This morning, a counter-move emerged that broke on March 14th and has not yet been placed in its full context by most ongoing coverage. A senior Iranian official told CNN that Tehran is considering allowing a limited number of oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, but only if the cargo is traded in Chinese yuan. CNN noted that global oil is almost entirely traded in US dollars today, with the exception of sanctioned Russian oil, which trades in rubles and yuan. This proposal, if implemented, would represent a structural shift in how global energy is priced and settled across world markets. Mazer Pasha, executive director at Syndicate Capital, told The National that under the pressure of this conflict, what was once theoretical about de-dollarized energy markets is beginning to take practical shape. That framing deserves attention. The proposal is not confirmed policy. It is a signal delivered publicly through a named U.S. news organization while the strait remains closed. Its strategic function is to introduce a condition for reopening that Washington has no mechanism to accept, and that Beijing would benefit from a condition that transforms a military confrontation into a structural challenge to the petrodollar system that has underpinned American financial dominance for 50 years. Iran's armed forces also issued a direct counterthreat to the Kharg ultimatum. Confirmed by Iranian state media and reported by Reuters and Al Jazeera on March 14th, the statement declared that any attack on Iran's oil and energy infrastructure will lead to retaliatory strikes on facilities owned by U.S.-friendly oil companies across the region. That statement covers Saudi Aramco terminals, Abu Dhabi offshore platforms, and the Qatari LNG facilities at Ras Laffan, which supply roughly 30% of global liquefied natural gas. Patrick Dahan, analyst at GasBuddy, told Reuters, when Iran is backed into a corner, it is highly emboldened to act, and the Kharg strike elevates the temperature significantly. Yang Liang, deputy head of Treasury at the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, told The National that any disruption to Kharg operations is expected to quickly affect energy prices, and that the consequences for the global economy would be unpredictable. That is China's largest state-owned bank, publicly warning about the consequences of a conflict. It has significant economic exposure. It's to a signal of how wide the blast radius of this standoff has already become. The economic numbers on March 14th are extraordinary and deserve to be stated precisely. Brent crude closed Friday at $103.14 per barrel, according to CNBC, up from $72.87 on the eve of the war. That is a 42% increase in 15 days. Brent briefly touched $126 per barrel at its peak earlier this week, according to Wikipedia's tracking of the Hormuz crisis, the highest level in years. The IE called this the largest oil supply disruption in the history of global energy markets. In response, its 32 member nations agreed to release 400 million barrels of emergency reserves, the biggest coordinated stockpile action in the IEA's 50-year history. Markets absorbed the announcement, and Brent kept rising, because 400 million barrels covers approximately 26 days of the supply lost from Hormuz. And there is no confirmed timeline for when the strait reopens. Trump said on March 14th that many countries would send warships to keep Hormuz open, naming China, France, Japan, South Korea, and Britain. but providing no timeline or confirmed commitments. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khomeini, elected on March 8th following the death of his father on the first day of the war, vowed publicly that the strait would remain closed as a tool of pressure. Gas prices hit $3.63 per gallon on Friday, a 22-month high, according to AAA. Diesel has climbed to $4.83 per gallon, a 28% increase since the war started. Stead energy projects. Brent reaching $115 in a 2-month war scenario and $135 if the conflict stretches to 4 months. The Federal Reserve meets on March 18th, 4 days from today, and it is walking into the most complicated inflation decision it has faced in years. Before February 28th, U.S. inflation was running at 2.4% annually, above the 2% target, but moving in the right direction. The February jobs report, released just before the war began, showed the economy shed 92,000 jobs and unemployment ticked up to 4.4%. Under normal conditions, that labor market data alone would push the Fed toward cutting rates to support growth. Conditions are not normal on March 14th. Job losses say cut rates. Energy-driven inflation says hold or risk making an already elevated inflation problem significantly worse for American consumers. Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, told CNBC this week, higher oil prices are another negative supply shock, lifting inflation and hurting growth, putting the Fed in a no-win situation. That phrase, no-win situation, is not analyst hyperbole. It is a precise description of the institutional constraint the Federal Reserve is operating under right now. As of this morning, multiple sources tracking CME Fed Watch data show a 92 to 96% probability that the Fed holds rates unchanged at its March 18th meeting. Goldman Sachs pushed its next cut forecast from June all the way to September. Traders in Fed funds futures have taken even September off the table, pricing just one cut for all of 2026. The probability of 0 rate cuts in 2026 has climbed from 6% to nearly 16% in a single week, according to Briefs Finance tracking CME data. The Fed's benchmark rate sits at 3.502, 3.75%. That flows directly into mortgage rates, auto loan rates, credit card rates, and the cost of every business loan in the country. Gregory Dacko, chief economist at EY Parthenon, told PBS that the jump in gas prices alone could push monthly inflation to as high as 1% in March, the highest single-month reading in 4 years. Joe Brusuelas, chief economist at RSM, projected in a client note this week that headline inflation could climb back toward 3% in March and 3.5% or greater in April, as energy costs filter fully through. Bloomberg Economics described the Fed's position plainly this week. The war places it in an impossible spot, stuck between a conflict pushing inflation higher and a president demanding rates come down. Skylar Wynand, chief investment officer at Regan Capital, was direct: until the Strait of Hormuz reopens and the turmoil simmers down, the Federal Reserve may step away from any action on rates entirely. Kevin Warsh, Trump's nominee to replace Jerome Powell as Fed chair in May, would inherit an institution frozen by a conflict the current administration chose to start. Stephen Cates, financial analyst at Bankrate, told CNBC, unlike tariffs, which take months to filter into prices meaningfully, increases in oil prices are quickly reflected in what consumers pay. Brett House, economics professor at Columbia Business School, told CNBC that the attack on Iran has made life more expensive and more uncertain for American households. Oil prices up, Treasury yields up, mortgage rates up, all three compressing affordability from every direction simultaneously. CBS News polling published this week shows Trump's approval rating on handling of the conflict has dropped measurably as gas prices rise. The president, who campaigned on controlling inflation and lowering the cost of living, is now presiding over a war that is the primary obstacle to delivering on that commitment, and the political cost of that gap is building faster than most analysts projected when the first bombs fell on Tehran 2 weeks ago. Here is the detail that almost no coverage of this war is stating clearly. According to the New York Times, Iran quietly reached out to the CIA, asking to discuss terms for ending this conflict. It's a back-channel contact that happened on March 4th through another country's intelligence service. Iran's Tasnim news agency denied the report. Neither the White House nor the CIA contradicted the New York Times reporting. That silence was noted. The public posture on both sides is defiance. The private signal delivered through a foreign intelligence service and reported by the New York Times is that someone inside Tehran wants a way out. Both things can be true simultaneously, and in modern conflict history, that gap between public rhetoric and private outreach is consistently where wars end. Trump's response to the outreach was revealing. Said publicly, "Most of the people we had in mind are dead. Pretty soon, we are not going to know anybody to negotiate with." That is not the statement of a president who has found a negotiating counterpart. It is the statement of one watching the other side's leadership structure collapse faster than a deal can be assembled. Saudi Arabia has privately offered to mediate, according to sources cited by Al Jazeera, a country that was itself targeted by Iranian missiles during the first week of this conflict. Oman, which brokered the original 2015 nuclear framework talks, has made its channels available. China's foreign minister spoke with both sides in the first week of the conflict. The diplomatic architecture for a deal exists. The economic incentive for both sides to reach one is visible, growing, and being felt across billions of people who had no vote in starting this war. What remains uncertain is whether the political will on both sides can move faster than the damage accumulating in the global energy system underneath this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz has been open for the entire modern history of global trade. Every prior threat to close it ended before it became permanent reality because Iran always had something left to lose. What is different on March 14, 2026 is that the calculation of what Iran has left to lose has changed faster and further than most analysts mapped before February 28th, and the consequences of that change are visible in the price of oil, in the decision the Federal Reserve faces in 4 days. In the back-channel contact, the New York Times confirmed, and neither Washington nor the CIA denied. Not in the missile counts, in the arithmetic.